Hello. Today I'm going to talk about one of my favourite heroes, an elf who has some incredible stories and poems written about him and one of the oldest characters you know of in Anglo-Saxon history. His name is Wayland, sometimes known as Wayland the Smithy or Volund from the sagas and the Poetic Edda. He was considered a hero, a legend, a weapon and armour smith of outstanding skill, and stories were written about him and told all across northwestern Europe for at least 700 years. But this story, his story, is no Disney fairy tale. It has kidnap, murder and misery woven in within its plot of amazements and atrocities. So welcome to the story of Weland, and welcome to Cleckenford. Wayland is a legend of Anglo-Saxon Europe, but also known across the Old Norse and Germanic cultures. He appears in many poems, stories, and is drawn and carved onto important historical items. He is considered a hero, seeking revenge against his oppressors, whilst making weapons and armour to allow one to defeat his foes, which is a great analogy to what I'm trying to do against Google, who have now even stopped promoting my Hovermore video on top of the videos about Christ. So this channel isn't as visible as it should be, so if you would like to support Cleckenford, it is free and only takes a second. Just please click the like button on this video, or please subscribe to the channel. It is really appreciated. Thank you. So, some of you here may be wondering if this Wayland has anything to do with the English tale about a Neolithic stone burial chamber in Oxfordshire, known today as Weland Smithy. Local legend says that a magical smith would shoe a horse for a traveller if a coin is left on a stone near the chamber, but only if the traveller leaves their horse and goes away for the night and then comes back in the morrow. However, as old as the legend of Wayland is, he is not as old as this 6,000-year-old burial chamber, and so in reality this has nothing to do with Wayland's true history, except that it exists as a remnant of local middle-aged myth. And so I feel there's little importance here in terms of the story of Wayland, so instead I will concentrate on his other tales and stories that directly relate to him. So, when does Wayland first appear in history? Well, the oldest evidence we have of the mention of Wayland is that of a gold coin, known as a solidus, found in eastern Frisian region of Germany, and on it there was runic writing that reads Wayland, which I will highlight on the picture. And although we cannot know for certain whether the name on the coin is referring to the smith who made it, who may have been named Wayland perhaps in honour of the legend Wayland, or whether it actually represents the legend himself directly, we do not know. But what we do know is that the coin is dated to around 600 CE, give or take 25 years, and thus it makes it around 1400 years old, and so the legend of Wayland is at least that old. There are also images of Wayland on picture stones in Scandinavia, the best example being that of the Ardre stone 8, which was probably made in the 900s, but we'll come back to that after I tell you the story of Wayland. The story of Wayland appears all over Europe, in Germany, Denmark, Norway, Belgium and England, with stones at Sysbeck in Sweden and Velerby in Jutland both being places where they said he is buried. So Wayland is often referred to as Weland the Smithy. So how do we know that he was a smithy? Well, the oldest attestation to this is the poem Beowulf, which is around 1,000 years old, and on lines 450 to 455 it mentions that Wayland had created armour worn by Beowulf. The lines in this poem read as follows: "No need then to grieve for long or bury my body. If the battle takes me, send back this breast-webbing armour that Wayland fashioned and Hrethel gave me to Lord Hygelac. Fate goes ever, as fate must." There is also a poem called Waldere, of which we only have 2 fragments remaining. The first verse in the first fragment, which is verse 2 of the poem, infers Wayland's skill at weapon making and reads, "Certainly a thing of Wayland's making will not fail anyone who can hold on to these hardy blades. Often in battle, blood-stained and wounded by this sword, one man after another has faltered. You are a soldier of Attila's vanguard. Do not let your courage falter, nor your dignity today. Son of Alfred, the day has now come where you must simply do one of two things. Let go of your life, or have lasting fame among men. To me, that is great poetry about war and how effective Weland's weapons were. The poem Waldere then goes on to mention Weland's son and has more fantastic imagery through Waldere himself. Waldere talks in the line, "He held in his hands the comforter of battle in brandishing of the war blades." Again, it explains the strength and power kings found in Weland's weapons. There is an old English poem called Dior, which also mentions Weland, and is found in the Book of Exeter. There is little left of this original poem, just 7 verses, of which only 2 really relate to Weland directly. And this poem doesn't allow us to add much to our knowledge of Weland, but it is assumed that due to the poem being in the book, that this poem is old, certainly 1st millennium CE. And I will read 2 verses from that after I tell you Weland's story, so as not to give you any plot spoilers. We also have evidence that even in the reign of King Alfred, towards the end of the 9th century, he is still considered a hero figure. As in Alfred's translation of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, he substituted in the name of Weland, the goldsmith who was most renowned, for that of also renowned Roman consul and general Fabricius. Weland also appears on Franks Casket. It's a whalebone box intricately carved and dated into the early 700s. Although this still does not date the poem, it shows that he was a major hero in the 7th century. However, the scene on the casket depicts part of his story that has been lost in the Anglo-Saxon texts. But there is one text we have that has his whole story, and this is an Old Norse poem found in the Poetic Edda, and it is called the Volundarikvida, the only Norse poem that describes a character, in this case Weland, as an elf. In this poem, being Old Norse, Weland is actually called Volund. So let me tell you the story of Volund, and then we can look again in detail at the picture stone, Franks Casket and the Old English poem Dior, and we can look at and understand those in more detail. So Volund's story goes like this. Once upon a time there was a king, King Finni, who had 3 sons, Egil, Slagfinn and Volund. There was also a king in the neighbouring kingdom, Nithith, and he had 2 sons and a daughter was named Bothvild. King Finni's 3 sons went out hunting for wild beasts and built a house by a lake. And one day they saw 3 women on the edge of that lake spinning thread, and near them lay 3 swan skins. The sons realised that these 3 women were Valkyries, and so they crept up and stole their swan skins. The Valkyries said they needed their skins back, but the men said that the only way they would get their skins back is if they would marry them, and so the sons of Finni married the Valkyries. But after 7 years of marriage, war called the Valkyries and they had to do their duty, and so they flew away leaving their husbands. Slagfinn and Egil left the house to try and find where their wives had gone, but Volund stayed home and was heartbroken. And whilst waiting and hoping for his wife's return, he smiths and makes 700 perfectly jewelled golden rings and threads them onto a rope. Now his neighbouring king, King Nithith, has heard Volund is alone, and so sends his men to capture him so he can use his smithing skills to create weapons and armour and jewellery like no other. The men arrive at Volund's home, but he is not there. He's gone bear hunting, and so they leave, but one of the men takes one of the golden rings that is threaded on the rope. When Volund comes back from hunting and notices one of his rings is now missing, he assumes that his wife, his Valkyrie, is back, and he sits so long awaiting her return to his home that he falls asleep waiting. But whilst he is asleep, King Nithith's men come back and they capture him, binding him in chains, and takes him back to King Nithith's hall. King Nithith asks where Volund acquired his gold, and Volund doesn't tell him, but just replies that it was not as much as he had at his home when he was in the Rhine valleys, when he was with his brothers Egil and Slagfinn. the king decides to give his daughter the golden ring that was taken. And the queen tells the king that she doesn't trust Volund. She thinks his eyes are like that of a serpent. She says that Volund should be killed, or at least put somewhere where he will not be able to harm anyone. And so the king, wanting Volund's smithing skills, has Volund's Achilles tendons cut. And then he places him on a small island, Sversfastøth. And on this island, Volund, who feels most aggrieved at what has gone on, plots his revenge against King Nitheth. Volund builds a workshop on the island and works non-stop to fashion things for the king. And it's not long before he's visited by the King Nitheth's two sons. They see Volund's chest in his workshop, and they think it is full of jewels, and they ask to look inside. He says they can, but on one condition, that they come back to his workshop the next day to do this, but not to tell anyone where they are going. They mustn't tell anyone they're going to the island to see Volund. The sons come back the next day, and Volund shows him his treasure chest. They kneel down in front of it, and Volund, he opens the lid just enough so the boys can fit their heads inside and see the contents of the chest. But let's stop there and go back to what happened that previous night. For Volund crafted an edge to the lid of the chest, an edge that was sharp and strong. And so, as the boys looked into the chest, Volund slams the lid shut, chopping off the boys' heads and leaving their headless bodies lying on the ground. Volund then goes about his craft, making fine drinking vessels from the skulls of the king's sons. He mixes their blood with honey to make a delicious mead, and he cooks their flesh and makes jewellery out of their eyeballs and brooches out of their teeth. He hides their feet under the bellows in his workshop, blood splattered everywhere. And then Volund gives the jewels to the king's wife and the brooch to the king's daughter Bolvilf. Some moons pass, and the king's daughter Bothfield goes to visit Volund and shows him that the ring she was given, the ring originally stolen from Volund, was broken, and asks if Volund will repair it. He says he will, and gives Bothfield beer to drink while she waits. He gives her so much beer that she gets so very drunk, and when she is in that condition, Volund lays with her. Then many more moons pass, and during that time Volund has built himself wings to allow him to fly like a bird, and he flies to the throne of Nitheth. The king asks Volund if he knows what has happened to his sons. Volund first asks the king to swear on a horse's back, a ship's deck and a sword's edge not to harm his bride. The king agrees, and then Volund tells the king his daughter is pregnant with his child. And if that wasn't shocking enough, Volund then tells the king exactly what has happened to his sons, and that he can even find his sons' legs in Volund's workshop, which is splattered with their blood. And then he flies away. The king calls in Bothfield and asks his daughter if it is true that she is pregnant with Volund's child, and she replies a truly sad reply. She says, "It is true what Volund said to you. He lusted me for an hour, and I never should have. But I could not fight against him. I was not strong enough to fight against him." And that is the story of Weland, told by the Old Norse. A tale of grief and revenge, one of my favourite stories in the Poetic Edda, with so much going on and such a sad and tragic ending, with the king left with no sons, but a daughter pregnant with a child of his enemy. So now we know the story of Wayland, we can look at some of the historical artefacts to see how important he was to the Anglo-Saxons and the Norse. First, I can now read the two verses from the Old English poem Dior, and this is my own translation interpretation, and it will make much more sense now you're familiar with the story of Volund. And in this version, the evil king is called Nithhad and his daughter Beowulf, and their cognates are the names in the Norse story, which makes sense. So the two verses go like this. Wayland, tied up in chains, was a victim of persecution. Single-minded, he endured many miseries. Sorrow and desire were his companions, suffering like the cold of winter. He found those many miseries after Nithhad had restrained him by cutting those needed ligaments on the better man. But that had to be overcome, so that this story may be. Beowulf was not as sad for the death of her brothers as she was for her own troubles. She knew she was pregnant, but she could have never imagined the outcome. That had to be overcome, so that this may be. And so in this version of the poem, Wayland was in misery and agony after Nithhad had put him in chains, and Beowulf was more upset to find out she was pregnant than to find out her brothers were murdered. Now, if we go back to look at the Ardre picture stone 8, the images may now make more sense. If we zoom in a little, I've highlighted from left to right the key parts of the story in red. First, we have the king's daughter Bothfield to the left, and on her right we have an eagle representing Volund flying, and then to his right we have a workshop, and behind this we have the two dead bodies of the king's sons. There is also a reference to the story of Weland on the Franks Casket, a box made of whalebone. This is 1300 years old, and it has runic writing around it, and on its panels there are representations of a number of stories. Anglo-Saxon heroic stories and Christian stories. The casket is currently in the British Museum in London, and I will show the front panel which has a scene from Wayland carved into the whalebone. And if I colorise the panel, the images become clearer. First on the right we have one of the sons taking the swan suits of the Valkyries. In the middle we have Beowulf and possibly a mother. And to the left we have Wayland. In one hand he is holding a cup made from the king's son's skull, which he is given to Beowulf, and in the other hand he has tongs, and in those tongs is the head of one of the king's sons. And on the floor to the left a headless dead body of a son of the king. Now whilst Egil, Wayland's brother in the Norse story, isn't spoken of much in the poems, not that I've talked about so far anyway, there is another version of this story in VIII saga, an old Norse saga dated about 1200s in Norway. And it is a source where many of the heroes are brought together and has a strong Germanic influence. There are variations in this version of the story to the version I've just told you from the Old Norse, with one being that Egil later turns up and starts working for King Nithhad, and then is ordered by King Nithhad to shoot Volund when he is flying away. Now Egil is an exceptional archer and fires at his brother, and the arrow hits Volund and he is seen bleeding. But we find out Volund was carrying a bag of blood, and Egil had aimed to hit that, so Volund only appears to be injured. And to add further insult to King Nithhad, the blood actually turns out to be that of the king's sons. Egil's prowess with a bow and arrow is also possibly represented on the Franks Casket as well, on its lid. Here I've highlighted him with a bow and arrow, and it is believed that this scene is from a lost story where he is fending off an army with his wife behind him. Also, some scholars think that this may be instead a scene which represents the Trojan War. Also in VIII saga, Volund eventually makes peace with Nithhad's family, and his son eventually becomes a champion of the kingdom. Now that is a fitting way to end an heroic story. And so there we have it. The story of Wayland, an elven smith of great skill who made the best armour and weapons for kings, jewellery for queens, but also made wings to allow him to fly. He was a legend, a hero who suffered misery and pain, but had fame of such magnitude that his stories were being told throughout northwestern Europe for over 700 years. So I hope you enjoyed the story. Please subscribe if you want to watch the next one. And so stay safe, stay well, and this was Krakenford.